Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. This video is part 3 of now what has become a series, and that is where I go through every product within a certain makeup category and I discuss how many times I've reached for each of them. And today we're going to be doing eyeshadow palettes. I did my first version of this video I think back in May of 2020, and then I did another version of this last August, so August of 2022. And now it's September of 2023, just over a year later, and I wanted to do an updated version. I love doing these types of videos because number one, I do track uses, and I think that's useful information to share, or at least somewhat interesting or valuable in some way. And it's also incredibly valuable for me because in my head I have a lot of palettes that I've had for years and I really love them. I think very highly of them, but does that actually translate into me reaching for them more? I will put a list of what eyeshadow palettes I have in my collection, and if you would like, you're more than welcome to guess in the comments which one you think is my most used palette. My most used overall, but then which one have I used the most in the last year? Those are two different answers. I will start from my least used palette up to my most used, and my least used palette is this one from What's Up Makeup. It's the Geodes palette, and this is a really beautiful palette. I've sung its praises before. I love these sorts of colors. I love the mixes of different shimmer shades with the mattes. I think this is a really good quality palette. The other palette I have from this brand is also one that I think very highly of. I love the packaging. I love how you get 12 shades, but it's very compact. I just think this is a very secure, compact palette. I could travel with this and not be worried about it shattering. And I received this in PR back in February, so I've had it for about 5 months, and I've reached for this 8 times. The majority of those uses are from whenever I first received the palette, and I set it down, and then I kind of got some other new palettes that took my attention away. And then I had 2 palettes in particular that I know I did not use nearly enough in my last update. And so I said in that video I was going to make a point to reach for them more, and that's what I've been doing. So my number of uses for palettes has kind of gone to those other ones. But yeah, I think this is going to get a lot more use by the time I do my next update for this video. The next one is also a newer palette. I got this back in May, and this is the Shimmer Saga version. They have 2 versions that I know of, and this one was the one that had lighter shades. If you can see, this palette is mostly topper shades. They're really sparkly and shimmery. Beautiful. I love this palette, and I often reach for this not as its own, not to create looks on its own, but I will do a look and then think, oh, I can punch this up a little bit. I can make it even more sparkly, even more special and pretty. And I grab a shade from this palette and it just gives me the effect that I love. This is a very glittery type of formula, and so it has fallout if you're not careful. So if you're trying to avoid that altogether, then I would definitely use a wet brush, and then I would do your face makeup after you do your eye makeup, and that way if there's any fallout you can wipe it off before doing the rest of your face. But this one I've reached for 18 times, and I would say pretty much every single time I'm just reaching for 1, maybe 2 shades to complete an already existing look. So those were 2 newer palettes that I didn't have in my last update because I didn't own these last year, but this one I did own last year, and I had mentioned that I've only reached for it a few times and I wanted to reach for it more, and I have, and that is this Geology Cosmetics palette. This is the Pilbara palette, and last time I mentioned I had only reached for this 5 times, and now I've reached for it 18 times. So I've reached for it an additional 13 times, and I would say the majority of the times I reached for it, I was trying to hit pan on this shade because it was in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, and then this green sparkly shade here. It's my favorite shade from the palette. It's gorgeous, beautiful topper shade. So I would say the majority of the use was just from those 2 palettes alone. I do really like these mattes. I think these are really unique colors too. And overall, I do like this palette, and so I'm excited to reach for this more in the autumn months. The next one is the Desert Monsoon palette, again from What's Up Makeup. And it's interesting because I've had this for less time than I've had the Geodes palette. I got the Geodes palette in February, and I got this one in April. So I've had it only for like 4 or 5 months. And also when you look at the color story, and if you know anything about my personal taste in eyeshadow and in colors, you would think that the Geodes would be the color story that I gravitate towards more, but I've actually reached for this quite a bit more than the Geodes palette. And this one I have reached for 28 times. Again, I just really like how small and compact these are. I love that there is a good mix of shimmers and mattes, and you do have some really beautiful shades, but they're a little bit more unique, and they just, I don't know, they make color approachable for me. Even these like really bright, shimmery, colorful shades are really brightening and light, and so I can put them on and not feel like it's super deep. Yeah, I've been really loving this. I've been really loving reaching for these shades. This shade here, Humidity, is a beautiful pinky taupe shade, but it has a little bit of a purple to it, so it makes it really unique out of all the other pinky shimmer shades that I have. This shade here, Desert Rose, has like a really light pink base, and then it has a gold shift. That's also very unique in my collection. And overall, I just think these shadows perform really well, and I'm just really glad to have both of these. I think they're beautiful. All right, this next one I'm really proud of, and that is the Shroud Arcana palette, and I wanted this for a long time. It took me a while to finally actually purchase it, and then when I did, I just didn't really use it. These are much deeper shades than I guess I would normally go for. I typically go for lighter shades, more brightening eye looks. In my last update, I had only reached for this 3 times, and in the past year, my number of uses has gone up to 31 times, which is awesome. I have reached for every shade in this palette, and I think these are beautiful. I love this Chalice shade here. I didn't think I would go for such a deep, warm gold, but I love how this looks on my eyes. I really love it a lot. Of course, I love a grayish taupe shade, so this shade, Nocturnal, is really pretty. I love using darkling to deepen up eye looks, but maybe I don't want to just use a regular brown. I want something with a little bit more of a different undertone to it. Just stunning overall. I really love this. It's, again, not a palette that I would create complete looks with. I use it sort of as a companion palette to deepen up or add something interesting to whatever eye look that I have going on. And I feel really good about having reached for it more because it's a palette where in theory I really like it, but actually reaching for it was just something I wasn't doing. Same with this next one. It's the Give Me Glow Juicy Olive palette. If you've been following my content for a while, you'll know that I always speak so highly of this palette, but I don't actually reach for it. It's just not an everyday sort of eyeshadow palette for me. And so when I first did this video back in 2020, I had only reached for it 4 times. And then in August of last year, I had been reaching for it more, and I reached for it 22 times. And now my number is 35 times. I feel pretty good about that. And again, I'm just gonna try to remember to reach for this more as time goes on. All right, this next palette is actually a compilation of singles that I put together. It's the Lethal Cosmetics Build Your Own Palette Scenario. And so I have mostly duochromes and multi-chromes. Ooh, I have a missing shade, but it's a full palette normally. I have 1 matte, but I really love these shimmer shades, and I really love all the different types of colors that I have. I did do a whole video of this where I swatched it and showed looks that I created with it. I tried to be a little bit more depth describing the shade and formula of each one. I actually recently hit pan on one of the shades here. This is Retrograde. And it was funny because I had hit pan on it while I was filming a tutorial, but it was a no brand tutorial where I wasn't sharing with you which products I was actually using. I was just focusing on the techniques and on the formula. And so I hit pan on it, and I couldn't even show you in that video because the whole point was for you not to know what I was wearing. But yeah, that's definitely my most used shade, that one and this one up here, which I think is called Ceres. It's a white shade and it has a really beautiful blue, pink, purple shift to it. I wear that a lot on the inner corner. In my last update, I had reached for this 13 times. Since then, I've reached for it 38 times total. And that makes sense. I reach for this a lot. I love this palette, and I'm glad that the numbers accurately reflect how much I really like this palette. I just really love the packaging and how you can make it feel like an actual palette, but then you can take out the shades and rearrange them and make them your own. I just think that's a really great design. This next one really surprised me. It's one of my favorite palettes, and I had reached for it 43 times in my last update, and now my number is only 49. So I've only reached for it 6 times in the last year. And I'm talking about the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette. Doesn't that seem strange that I've only reached for it 6 times when it's one of my favorite palettes in my collection? I love this palette. Very confusing. I don't have an explanation for that. This next one I'm also incredibly proud of, and that's the It's Freakin' Bats palette. Oops. It's Freakin' Bats palette from Shroud Cosmetics. And I do have pan on this now, which I don't think I had in my last update. And that's because I randomly generated this shade here, Dairy, in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project. So I was reaching for this palette enough to try to hit pan on that shade in particular. And since then, I have really been loving these matte shades, particularly this one here, Adams. It's like a dark teal. And I've been wearing a lot of light blue, silvery, light purple eyeshadows, like shimmer shades on my lids, and sometimes I want to add a little bit of depth to the outer portion of my eye, but I want to use something unique and fun and kind of play around with the different undertones. So I reach for this shade in particular a lot, and it's starting to get a little bit of a dip in it. And so I have found in the last year, I've been reaching for the mattes more than the shimmers, which when I first purchased it, it was actually the shimmers that I liked more than the mattes. And so in my last update, I had only worn it 5 times. Since then, that number of uses has jumped up to 53 times. I'm really proud of that. I'm glad to see so much use and love on a palette that I really, really like, especially one that has such a unique, interesting color story. I did have a question for the other people who own this palette and purchased it around the same time that I did. I think I received this maybe 6 months or so after it originally launched, and back then, the shimmers were really creamy and I could dip my finger in and pat them on my lid and get the color payoff that I wanted. And I find that now when I do that, they feel a little bit thicker. And when I pick it up on my finger, it'll show up. But when I try to pat it on my lid, for some reason, I can't get it to adhere to my lid. It only stays on my finger. So now I have to use a wet brush, which I already do anyway for most shimmer shades, but now I can't just quickly use my finger if I feel like it. I don't understand that. It just feels really thick and it feels so different from how it used to feel. I'm not sure how to fully explain it, but has anyone else noticed a change in the shimmer shades in this palette? The mattes are still performing just fine. Nothing has changed with the mattes, but it seems like all of the shimmer shades have slightly thickened up a little bit. Are they drying out? Have they expired? What's going on? Please help me. Or maybe they've just always been like that and I haven't really noticed until I started playing with other shimmer shades from other formulas. I'm not sure, but I love this. I'm so glad I've been able to make a point to reach for it more, because that was a goal that I had set for myself last year. And with the Halloween months, the autumn, fall months coming up, I'll get to use these palettes even more, so I'm excited. This next one also surprised me, and that's the Limoncello palette from ColourPop. In my last update, I had reached for it 32 times. I'm now at 68 uses. This is arguably one of the warmest eyeshadow palettes that I have, but I love the packaging, I love the formula. I do really like this palette, and I'm just really surprised at how much I've been reaching for the yellows. These 3 shades right here, I reach for these all the time. I just did a video, it was a tutorial on Instagram and on TikTok where I did like a sunflower inspired makeup look, and I used shades from this palette. And I'm not normally like a yellow person, but I was just in the mood for it, and I find myself reaching for this shade in particular all the time. It looks like it'll just be a light pale gold, but it has a really yellow gold shift to it, and it's beautiful in the inner corner. And then Serenade is such a beautiful bright yellow shimmer. I don't have anything else like that in my collection. I love it. I've just been reaching for this so much. This was a really big summer palette for me this year, and so I am glad to see that I've reached for it more. Yeah, I just was really surprised. I looked at the numbers and I was like, wow, I've reached for that 30 plus times in the last year. This next one, I'm also really glad to see that I've reached for it more, and that's the Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette. And this is a palette, I think I mentioned it in my last update, where I think it's beautiful. I love the formula of Sydney Grace, but this palette just doesn't jump out to me, and I never really have it in mind whenever I'm doing my makeup, and so I just don't reach for it as much as I probably should. And then I went red for a long time. I had red hair, I think it was last October, and it stayed red for a long time. And so I used this pink shade, Darcy, to tint my eyebrows so that they better matched my hair. So I was reaching for this palette a lot just to fill in my brows and make them match my hair better. And then I do love this shade here, Devotion. This is just such a gorgeous shade. I also really love John. It's like a silvery pale gold shade, but it has a green tint. And yeah, I don't know if I gave you the numbers yet, but in my last update, I had reached for this 20 times. I now have reached for it a total of 69 times. So what is that? 49, almost 50 uses in the last year. Again, this next one, I am so surprised at how little, how infrequent I've reached for this. I don't know how to word that. Anyway, I've only reached for this 7 times in the last year, and this is one of my most used palettes historically, so I am very surprised. The Too Faced Natural Nudes. This is such a staple everyday palette for me. I just look at this and I think, yeah, this is old reliable for sure. It just has a beautiful mix of different mattes. I like the shimmers, but I like the mattes a lot more. Last August, I had reached for this palette 121 times. It was in the top 5 most used palettes in my collection, and now my number of uses is only 128. 129 if you count me using it today. I don't have any explanation for that. I think I just legitimately forgot this existed. So this last one, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody because it's consistently one of my most used palettes, and it's also my oldest palette, and that's the Shroud Cosmetics Creepy Cute palette. I love this palette so much. I was just using this palette 2 days ago for a Goth-tember look, and so in my very first update back in May, I had reached for it 52 times. Last year, I had reached for it 122 times, and now my number is 141 times. So I haven't used it as much as I have in previous years, but I do still very much like this palette. I do always find myself needing it for very specific reasons. And I have Pan in 5 of the shades. And yeah, I don't think I had Pan in Tombstone in my last update. I think I was currently working on it in my Pan Those Eyeshadows project. And I love using this as a base. I'll put it all over the lid, and then I'll put a duochrome or a multi-chrome on top, and it just really helps it shine and really helps different colors pop out having that darker base. But it's not so dark that it makes my eyes look smaller like maybe a black eyeshadow would. The mattes from Shroud are just top tier. I love all of the Shroud mattes that I have. It's one of my favorite formulas I've ever tried, and this is one of my favorite palettes. So yeah, it's my most used palette overall. When I think about the ones I've used the most in the last year though, that is a different answer. Let me do the math real quick. So my top 5 used eyeshadow palettes are the Sydney Grace Enduring Love, coming in at 49 uses. The It's Freakin' Bats palette, coming in at 48 uses. The Limoncello palette at 36 uses. And then the Desert Monsoon and the Arcana palette are tied, and those have 28 uses in the last year. And then my least used palettes are, surprisingly, the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz palette. I've only reached for this 6 times. The Too Faced Natural Nudes palette I've only reached for 8 times. The What's Up Geode palette I've reached for 8 times. The Juicy Olive palette I have reached for 12 times. And the Geology palette I've reached for 13 times. I'm assuming it's because in my head, I know that these are 2 of my most used palettes, and so I decided to shift my focus over to some of my lesser used palettes so that I could kind of keep it more even. But yeah, and I also wanted to just give a little bonus number, and that's the ABH Sultry palette. I did declutter that earlier this year, and so I'm not counting it as part of this countdown, but I do have the numbers, so I thought I would share it. In May of 2020, I had reached for it 140 times. It was one of my most used palettes. And then last year, that number had jumped up to 215 times. And if that were in this lineup today, I've reached for it over 300 times. And so if it were part of the lineup here, it would actually be my most used palette in last year because I've reached for it an additional 85 times. And so I'm not technically counting that, but if you guessed ABH Sultry, you would not be wrong technically. So that is the entire breakdown of my eyeshadow palette collection. In past years, I've done lip products, I've done blushes, I might have also done highlighters, but my highlighter collection has been dwindling over time. And so I don't know if that one would be worth doing. And outside of blushes and lip products, I can't really think of any other category in my makeup collection where doing a video like this makes sense. So please let me know if you'd like to see more content like this. I do already track the numbers, so it's relatively easy to put together videos like this. And I think that they're really interesting and they're like a really good look into a different aspect of how I use and enjoy the makeup that I have. But that's everything I have. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!